The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly rhythm under the oppressive August sun, a metronome counting out the life of another farm piece by piece. Jedediah Stone stood near the back, leaning against the fender of his old Chevy C10, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't here to buy, not really. He was here to watch, to feel the pulse of the county, to see which way the financial winds were blowing, and today they were blowing hot and fast. This was the Miller place, not Warren Miller's, but his uncle's, a man who'd farmed the same way Jed's grandfather had, with cash, caution, and a deep distrust of bankers' smiles. But his sons didn't want the life, and so here it all was, laid out in neat rows in the hayfield, a lifetime of iron and sweat up for grabs. Jed's eyes scanned the crowd. It was a sea of familiar faces, weathered by sun and worry. But the man holding court near the front was Warren Miller. Warren was Jed's age, but he moved and talked like he owned the whole county already. He'd taken over his father's modest operation 5 years back and had been expanding like a brush fire ever since. He was the local bank's golden boy, the face of the new way of farming. He was loud, confident, and dressed in a clean button-down shirt, a stark contrast to the sweat-stained work shirts of the older men around him. Jed's gaze drifted from Warren to the machinery. A decent Farmall M, a John Deere 60 that had seen better days, a New Holland baler. Then his eyes locked on it. Tucked away at the end of a row, looking like a forgotten monument to a bygone era, sat a beast. It was a versatile 145, one of the first true four-wheel drive articulated tractors to hit the fields. It was massive, all hard angles and raw power, but time had been cruel. The original red paint was mostly gone, replaced by a deep, scaly rust that bled down its flanks. The 8 huge tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the soft earth. A tangle of blackberry bushes had grown up through the drawbar. It looked dead. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson, finally worked his way down the line to it. "All right, boys, what we have here is—" "Well, it's a project," he admitted, wiping sweat from his brow with a red handkerchief. "A genuine early model versatile four-wheel drive. Hasn't turned over in a decade, I'm told. Engines are Cummins, but she's stuck tighter than a drum. We're selling it for scrap value, where is as is. Who'll give me $100 to start it? $100 for this piece of history?" Silence. The only sound was the buzzing of flies and a distant crow. Warren Miller let out a loud laugh that made heads turn. $100? Henderson, you ought to pay someone to haul that thing away. My new International could drag it to the scrapyard in 5 minutes flat. A few of Warren's cronies chuckled along with him. The older farmers just shook their heads, seeing not a project, but a money pit. Jed stayed silent, his eyes tracing the lines of the machine. He'd walked around it earlier, before the auction started. He'd seen the rust, the decay. But he'd also seen the bones. The frame was straight. The massive planetary axles looked intact. The articulation joint, the heart of the machine, showed no cracks in the welds. It was a simple, brutally effective design, built before computers and delicate electronics. It was built to last, if a man had the will to bring it back. "Come on now, gentlemen," Henderson pleaded. $50. Somebody give me $50 for the iron. Jed watched Warren preen. Warren had just taken delivery of a brand new International Harvester 1466, complete with a factory cab, air conditioning, and an AM/FM radio. He'd paid top dollar, all of it financed. He was farming more acres than anyone his age, but he was leveraged to the hilt. He saw the old Versatile as an insult, a relic of a past he was determined to bury under mountains of debt and shiny new paint. "All right, I'll give you $250 for it," a quiet voice called out. It was Jed, head swiveled in his direction. A low murmur went through the crowd. Jed Stone, who ran his grandfather's 80 acres with a meticulously maintained but ancient John Deere 4020, bidding on that pile of rust. Henderson's eyes lit up. $250 from Mr. Stone. Do I hear 3? An old farmer who collected antique tractors bid $300. Warren Miller, a smirk playing on his lips, decided to have some fun. $400, he said loudly, not even looking at the tractor, but at Jed. It was a clear challenge, a public game of chicken. The crowd went quiet. $400 was serious money for what most considered scrap metal. They all looked at Jed, expecting him to back down. He was known for being frugal, for making every penny scream. This was just Warren being a bully. Jed didn't even look at Warren. His eyes were still fixed on the tractor. He thought of his 4020, a good tractor, the best of its day, but it was only two-wheel drive. On a wet spring or a hard fall pull, it struggled. He thought of the deep black soil on his North 40, soil that could swallow a lesser tractor whole. He thought of what a machine like that, a true four-wheel drive, could do for him. Not for show, but for work, for survival. He lifted his chin slightly, and his voice cut through the humid air, calm and clear. $500. The finality in his tone was unmistakable. Henderson didn't even wait for another bid. 500 once, 500 twice, sold for $500 to Jedediah Stone. The gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Warren Miller just laughed, shaking his head as he turned to his friends. Some people got more money than sense, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Enjoy your new lawn ornament, Stone. Hope you like the view from your porch, 'cause that thing ain't ever moving from where it sits. Jed ignored him. He walked toward the auctioneer's table, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He counted out 25 crisp $20 bills, the ink still dark, the paper still stiff. It was cash, earned from selling a few extra hogs that spring. It wasn't borrowed, it was his. As he paid, he could feel the weight of the county's judgment on his shoulders. They saw a fool. He saw a foundation. Now, before we get into the grease and the grit of rebuilding that old iron horse, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever bought something that everyone else called junk, but you saw the potential? A car, a tool, a piece of land. Let me know down in the comments what it was and how it turned out. Because Jed Stone wasn't just buying a tractor. He was buying a future, one bolt at a time. Getting the versatile home was a battle of its own. It was a dead weight of more than 15,000 pounds, and it was 3 miles, mostly uphill, to Jed's farm. The tires wouldn't hold air for more than 10 minutes, so the first day was spent breaking the massive beads, patching the rotten inner tubes, and fighting to get them reseated with a portable air tank and a 5-pound hammer. By sundown, he had 4 tires that were at least round and holding pressure. The next morning, he brought his 4020. The John Deere looked almost small, hooked to the front of the articulated behemoth. He wrapped a heavy logging chain around the Versatile's front axle, took a deep breath, and eased the clutch out. The 4020's diesel engine deepened its tone, the rear tires dug in, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of tortured metal and the sucking sound of tires pulling free from the mud they'd settled in for a decade, the Versatile moved. The trip was a slow, grinding procession. The 4020 strained in its lowest gear, its exhaust stack puffing black smoke with every turn of the engine. Jed had to stop every quarter mile to let his tractor cool down, its radiator hissing like an angry snake. Cars slowed as they passed, the drivers staring. He saw Warren Miller drive by in his new Ford pickup, a slow pass with a long, mocking look. Jed just kept his eyes forward, his hands firm on the steering wheel, his jaw set. It took him the better part of 2 days to drag his prize home. He parked it in the grassy area between his barn and his workshop, where it slumped onto the ground, looking even more derelict and hopeless than it had at the auction. For a week, it just sat there, a monument to what everyone in the county was now calling Jed's folly. The talk at the co-op was merciless. Heard Jed Stone starting a museum for retired farm anchors. That $500 could have bought a lot of paint for that old barn of his. Jed let them talk. He was busy finishing up his summer chores, cultivating his soybeans one last time, getting his equipment ready for harvest. But every evening, as the sun went down, he'd grab a cup of coffee and walk out to the old tractor. He'd circle it, study it, run his hands over the cold, rusted steel. He wasn't just looking. He was planning. He was mapping out the campaign that lay ahead. Finally, the day came. He finished his chores early, pulled the doors of his workshop wide open, and backed the 4020 up to the Versatile one last time. He dragged it onto the concrete floor of the shop, the huge space suddenly seeming small and crowded, the air filled with the smell of rust and damp earth. Jed stood there for a long moment, then walked over to his workbench, picked up a 3/4-inch wrench, and placed it on the first bolt on the engine's valve cover. The battle had begun. The teardown was a slow, brutal process. Every bolt was a war. They were frozen solid with rust, their hex heads rounded and worn. Jed soaked them in penetrating oil for days, the sharp, chemical smell hanging heavy in the air. He'd tap them with a hammer, heat them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then hit them with a breaker bar, putting his entire body weight into it. Sometimes he was rewarded with a sharp crack as the rust gave way. More often, the bolt would shear off with a sickening ping, leaving him with another problem to solve later. He worked with a methodical patience that bordered on religious devotion. He built a heavy A-frame hoist from some old I-beams to lift the hood, then the radiator, then finally the engine itself. The Cummins was a monster, an inline-six that weighed over a ton. As he lifted it free of the frame, decades of grime and grease fell to the floor. With the engine on a stand, he began the autopsy. Pulling the head was the moment of truth. He strained on the last head bolt, and it came free with a groan. Using a pry bar, he carefully broke the seal. The sight underneath made his stomach clench. The number 5 and 6 cylinders were full of rusty water. The cylinder walls were deeply pitted, like the surface of the moon. He tried to turn the crankshaft with a 4-foot bar. It wouldn't budge. The engine was seized solid, just as the auctioneer had said. This was the point where any sane man would have given up, called the scrapyard, and admitted defeat. Warren Miller drove by again that week, slowing down just enough to see the disassembled engine parts laid out on Jed's shop floor like the bones of some prehistoric animal. The smirk on his face was wider than ever. But Jed wasn't a sane man, not in the way the world was coming to measure sanity. He didn't see a pile of junk. He saw a puzzle. He spent his evenings after chores under the single bare bulb of his workshop, a service manual spread open on his workbench. He read about cylinder sleeves, oversized pistons, bearing tolerances. He learned the engine inside and out, not from a classroom, but from the greasy pages of a book and the feel of the steel in his hands. He took the head to a machine shop in the next town over. The old German machinist shook his head. "It's bad," he said, running a finger over the pitted valve seats. "Cost you more to fix this than it's worth." "Can you fix it?" Jed asked, his voice quiet. The machinist looked at Jed, saw the determination in his eyes, and sighed. "I can, but it won't be cheap." Jed nodded. "Do it." He spent the winter disassembling, cleaning, and cataloguing every single part of that tractor. The transmission, the differentials, the planetary hubs. He drained the hydraulic system, and what came out was a milky brown sludge. He labeled every gear, every bearing, every bolt, and stored them in meticulously organized coffee cans and wooden boxes. His shop, once a place of repair, had become a place of resurrection. He was covered in a permanent layer of grease and grime, his hands cracked and stained black. He was alone, sustained only by his own stubborn will and the belief that what is owned, what is earned, holds a power that what is borrowed never can. The years began to tick by. The early 1970s arrived, and with them a change in the wind. It started with whispers of massive grain sales to the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the price of corn didn't just rise, it exploded. It doubled, then nearly tripled. A wave of prosperity, the likes of which no one had ever seen, washed over the heartland. Land prices, which had been stable for a generation, went ballistic. A farmer's net worth could double in a single year, on paper at least. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was cheering it on, telling farmers to get big or get out, to borrow money, buy land, and plant fence row to fence row. It was a modern-day gold rush, and the bankers were handing out the pans. Warren Miller became the local hero of this new age. He was no longer just the bank's golden boy, he was a prophet. He used his soaring land equity as collateral to borrow even more, buying up 2 more neighboring farms at prices that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He traded in his 1466, which was barely 3 years old, for a brand-new, top-of-the-line International Harvester 4366. It was an articulated 4-wheel drive, the direct descendant of the rusted beast sitting in Jed's shop. Warren's new tractor was a gleaming red monster with dual wheels all around, a quiet air-conditioned cab and a stereo system. He built a massive new machine shed to house his fleet of new equipment and started construction on a sprawling new ranch-style house on a hill overlooking his expanding empire. He was the man everyone pointed to, the embodiment of success. Jed felt the boom too. The prices he got for his corn and soybeans were record-breakers. For the first time in his life, he had a substantial amount of money in his savings account at the bank. The pressure on him was immense. The banker, who used to greet him with a polite nod, now called him into his office, spreading out loan applications and maps of available land. "Jed, you're sitting on a gold mine," he'd say. "Your land is worth a fortune. You could leverage that, buy up the old Henderson place. Double your acreage overnight. Everyone's doing it." Neighbors who used to be friendly now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. At the diner, the talk was always the same. Can you believe Jed Stone? Prices like this, and he's still tinkering with that old piece of junk instead of buying land. His grandfather must be rolling in his grave. They saw him as a failure, a man paralyzed by fear, unable to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. Jed just smiled, thanked the banker for his time, and kept doing what he was doing. He sold his grain, paid his property taxes, and put the profits into two places, his savings account and the Versatile. He ordered parts, not from the local dealer, but from salvage yards and specialty suppliers he found in the back of farm magazines. He paid for a machine shop to bore the engine block and fit it with new sleeves. He found a set of oversized pistons in a warehouse in Kansas. He painstakingly rebuilt the injector pump himself on his kitchen table night after night. Slowly, painfully, over the course of those boom years, the tractor came back together. The engine, clean and repainted in its original Cummins beige, went back into the frame. He re-cored the radiator, replaced every hydraulic hose, rebuilt every cylinder. He didn't have the money for a new set of tires, so he bought used ones from a heavy equipment yard, mismatched but solid. The day finally came in the fall of '76. He had the fuel system bled, the batteries charged. He climbed up into the simple metal seat, the steel cold beneath him. He took a deep breath, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The big engine turned over slowly, sluggishly. 1 revolution, 2. It coughed out a puff of white smoke. He held the button down. A 3rd revolution, a 4th. Then a single cylinder fired. Then another. A cloud of black smoke erupted from the straight pipe exhaust, and with a deep guttural roar that shook the windows of the workshop, the Cummins engine came to life. The sound was magnificent. It wasn't the refined whine of a new tractor. It was a deep, throaty, mechanical thunder. It was the sound of power, raw and untamed. It echoed across Jed's small valley, a sound of defiance that had been silent for over a decade. He let it run for 20 minutes, his eyes scanning the gauges, his ears listening for any wrong notes in the mechanical symphony. Everything was perfect. The oil pressure was steady, the temperature was climbing slowly. It was alive. A few days later, Warren Miller drove down Jed's lane. It was the first time he'd ever come onto Jed's property. He stopped his shiny new truck and got out, leaving the engine running. He walked over to the shop where Jed was adjusting the clutch linkage on the now-running tractor. The Versatile was still ugly, a patchwork of rusted metal and mismatched primer, but it was no longer a corpse. It was a living, breathing machine. "Heard you got that old junker running," Warren said. His voice lacked its usual mocking tone. It was flat, almost strained. "She runs," Jed replied, not looking up from his work. Warren walked around the tractor, his eyes taking in the rebuilt engine, the new hoses, the massive mismatched tires. He was quiet for a long time. "Still," he finally said, a bit of his old arrogance returning, "can't pull what my new 4366 can." He got back in his truck and drove away, but Jed had seen it. For the first time in Warren Miller's eyes, there wasn't just scorn. There was a flicker of something else, something that looked an awful lot like worry. That evening, as Jed cleaned the grease from his hands, the radio on his workbench crackled with the national news. An announcer with a somber voice was talking about runaway inflation, about interest rates climbing to unheard-of levels. He mentioned a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, and his stated mission to break inflation's back, no matter what the cost to the American economy. Outside, the autumn wind was picking up, rattling the tin roof of the workshop. A storm was gathering on the horizon, a financial hurricane of historic proportions. And as the first cold drops of rain began to fall, only one man in the county was standing on a foundation of paid-for steel, ready for the flood to come. The first sign of the coming trouble wasn't on the financial pages or the nightly news. It was in the sky. The spring of 1979 arrived cold and sullen. A low grey ceiling of cloud settled over the county and refused to leave, drizzling a miserable, chilling rain day after day, week after week. The fields turned to a thick black gumbo, the kind of mud that could pull a boot off a man's foot and swallow a tractor tire to its axle. Jedediah watched the calendar, a knot tightening in his gut with each passing day. The planting window was closing. His John Deere 4020, as reliable as it was useless. Its two drive wheels would just spin, digging themselves into a deeper grave. Across the valley, he could see Warren Miller's massive new machine shed, its doors shut tight. Warren's fleet of red iron, including the gleaming Ford 366 articulated tractor, sat idle. For all its horsepower, it couldn't defy the laws of physics and float over the saturated earth. By the third week of May, the rain finally broke. A frantic, desperate energy seized the county. Every farmer knew they were dangerously behind schedule. The roar of diesel engines filled the air from dawn until well after dusk. Jed didn't even try with the 4020. He walked to his workshop, swung open the big doors, and climbed onto the cold steel seat of the Versatile. The big Cummins roared to life, its voice a deep-chested thunder that seemed to push back against the damp air. He eased it out of the shop, the 8 mismatched tires barely marking the soft ground, the machine's immense weight distributed perfectly. He hooked it to his 16-foot field cultivator, dropped the shanks into the ground, and pushed the throttle forward. The tractor didn't hesitate. It leaned into its work, the engine note deepening to a steady, powerful growl, the 4 big wheels clawing at the mud, finding traction where there should have been none. It moved across the field with a relentless momentum, leaving a trail of perfectly tilled soil in its wake. He worked around the clock, stopping only for fuel and a few hours of sleep. In 2 days, he had all his ground worked and ready for the planter. As he finished his last field, the one bordering Warren Miller's land, he saw Warren's 4366 for the first time that spring. It was halfway across a field, sitting at a strange angle, silent. Jed watched for a moment through his binoculars. He could see Warren pacing around it, his arms waving in frustration. The next day, the co-op was buzzing. Warren's new tractor, the pride of the county, was dead. Something in the complex hydraulic system that controlled the steering and the 3-point hitch had failed. The dealer's mechanic had come out, taken one look, and shaken his head. It was a specialized valve block deep in the guts of the machine. They didn't have one in stock. It would take a week to get the part from the regional warehouse, maybe longer. Every day the tractor sat, Warren was losing thousands of dollars in potential yield. Jed, meanwhile, had finished planting. His corn was in the ground. He spent the day the dealer's mechanic was at Warren's place working on his own machine. A universal joint in the front drive shaft of the Versatile had started to click, a telltale sign of wear. He drove it back to the shop, used his chain hoist to support the drive shaft, and in 3 hours had the old joint pressed out and a new, standard-sized one that he kept on his shelf pressed in. By afternoon, he was back in the field, hooking up his planter. No dealer, no waiting for parts, no $1,000 repair bill. Just a $30 part and an afternoon of his own labor. That summer, the sky turned against them again. The rain shut off completely. A brassy, unforgiving sun beat down, baking the wet spring fields into something resembling concrete. The corn, planted late and shallow, began to suffer. Its leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. Jed's crop suffered too, but his, planted earlier, had a deeper root system. It held on, its leaves a darker shade of green than his neighbor's. The first cracks in Warren Miller's empire began to show. The construction on his new house stopped abruptly. The half-finished frame sat on its hill like a skeleton, a monument to a future that was suddenly in doubt. Warren himself was a changed man. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. At the diner, he no longer held court. He sat alone in a corner booth, staring into his coffee cup. The whispers started. People said the bank was calling him every day. The price of diesel fuel had nearly doubled, and the interest on his massive operating loan, which he had to take out every spring to buy seed and fertilizer, had jumped from 8% to 12%. One sweltering afternoon in August, Jed was in his shop, fabricating a new drawbar support for his baler. A shadow fell across the doorway. It was Warren. He looked thin, his face etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there 6 months before. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't meet Jed's eyes. I need to borrow a tool. My welder quit on me." "Sure," Jed said, gesturing to the big Lincoln arc welder in the corner. "Help yourself." Warren hesitated. "Listen," he said, finally looking up. "That old tractor of yours. How did you know?" Jed stopped what he was doing and wiped his hands on a rag. "Know what?" "All of this," Warren said, his gesture taking in the fields, the sky, the whole troubled world. "Everyone was getting rich. The bankers were begging us to take money. How did you know not to?" Jed thought for a long moment. He looked past Warren, at the Versatile parked outside, its rusted metal shimmering in the heat. "My grandfather told me something once," he said quietly. "He said the bank will give you an umbrella when the sun is shining and demand it back the minute it starts to rain. I guess I just never forgot that." Warren stood there, the silence stretching between them. He finally just nodded, a slow, defeated gesture, then turned and walked back to his truck, forgetting entirely about the welder. Jed watched him go, feeling not a sense of victory, but a profound and weary sadness. The first clap of thunder from the coming storm had sounded, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that many of his neighbors were standing in the open field with no umbrella at all. The storm broke that fall. It wasn't a storm of wind and rain, but of numbers on a ledger and cold voices on the telephone. The news came over the radio in October. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. It was meant to be a political blow, but for the American heartland, it was an economic declaration of war. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel plummeted to less than $2. At the same time, the Federal Reserve, in a desperate battle against stagflation, slammed on the monetary brakes. Interest rates, which had already seemed high, went into orbit. The prime lending rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, soared to 15, then 18, then an almost unbelievable 21%. For farmers like Warren Miller, who were leveraged to the hilt with variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His operating loan, the one he used for fuel and seed, was now accruing interest at a rate of 23%. His long-term mortgages on the land he'd bought at inflated prices reset to 18%. The math was brutal and inescapable. He was paying more in interest every month than he had paid in a year just a few seasons before, all while the value of his crop had been cut in half. A plague of silence fell over the county. The frantic energy of the boom years evaporated, replaced by a quiet, pervasive dread. For sale signs began to appear on farm gates, handwritten and desperate. Then came the auction notices, tacked to the bulletin board at the co-op, printed in stark black ink. They weren't retirement sales anymore, they were foreclosure auctions. Liquidation, the end of the line. Jed felt the squeeze like everyone else. The low prices meant his profits were razor thin. But the difference was, he had no debt. His land was paid for, his machinery was his own. His property taxes were his only major expense. The money he had carefully saved during the good years, the money everyone had ridiculed him for not spending on more land, now served as a seawall against the rising tide of red ink. He could weather this. He cut back on everything, ate simpler meals, patched his own clothes, and kept his old Chevy running with junkyard parts. He survived. Warren did not. The bank gave him 90 days. He tried to sell land, but the market had collapsed. Land that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre during the boom now couldn't find a buyer at $800. He tried to sell his newer equipment, but the county was flooded with used machinery from other failed farms. His gleaming International 4366, which he'd paid a fortune for, was now worth less than half what he owed on it. The day of Warren Miller's auction was cold and grey, the sky the colour of lead. It was a mirror image of the auction where Jed had bought the Versatile years before, but the mood was entirely different. There was no excitement, no friendly chatter. The crowd was small and sombre, neighbours standing with their hands in their pockets, their faces grim, watching the dismemberment of a life. They were all thinking the same thing. This could be me next. The auctioneer, Henderson, looked 10 years older. His voice had lost its jovial rhythm and was now a flat, funereal monotone. He sold off the contents of the machine shed first, a planter for 10 cents on the dollar, a disc for even less. Then he came to the International 4366. It was pushed out into the yard, its red paint faded and mud-caked. It was the symbol of the era, the machine that was supposed to guarantee success. "All right, folks," Henderson said, his voice weary. "What am I bid for this International four-wheel drive? It's a good tractor, just needs a little work. Who'll start it at 20,000? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. 20,000 was a fraction of its original price, but it might as well have been $1 million. No one had that kind of cash, and no bank was lending. 15, Henderson pleaded. "Give me 15,000. Jed stood at the back, leaning against the fender of his old Chevy, just as he had done all those years ago. He watched Warren, who was standing near the house, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of hollowed-out despair. He wasn't even watching the sale of his own empire. He was just staring at the horizon, as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. Jed thought about bidding. He had the money, sitting in his savings account. He could buy that tractor for a song, a final crushing symbol of his vindication. The thought was tempting, a bitter taste of victory. But as he looked at Warren's broken figure, the taste turned to ash in his mouth. This wasn't a game. This was a man's life, and the lives of his wife and children being torn apart. He stayed silent. The bank's representative, a grim-faced man in a suit, finally placed a desperate bid of $10,000, and the tractor was sold back to the institution that had financed its purchase. The gavel fell not with a crack, but with a dull final thud. The auction of Warren Miller's farm was the talk of the county for weeks, a grim cautionary tale told in hushed tones over coffee at the diner. The bank took everything, the new land, the new equipment, the half-finished house on the hill. All that was left was the original 80 acres that Warren's father had farmed, the piece of ground that had been in his family for 3 generations. But even that was now the property of the bank, and the eviction notice was pending. Jed couldn't sleep. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling. The image of Warren's vacant eyes burned into his mind. He had been right. His caution, his frugality, his distrust of debt. It had all been vindicated. He had won the long silent war of philosophies. But the victory felt empty, the triumph sour. To win while his neighbours lost so much felt like a different kind of failure. 2 weeks after the auction, Jed put on a clean shirt, got in his truck, and drove into town. He didn't go to the diner or the co-op. He went to the bank. He sat down with the bank president, the same man who had once urged him to borrow and expand. The banker looked tired and stressed, his desk piled high with delinquent accounts. Jed got straight to the point. "Warren Miller's home place," he said. "The original 80 acres. What do you need to get for it?" The banker looked up, surprised. "Jed, you know what land is worth right now. It's not a good investment." "I'm not asking for investment advice," Jed said, his voice even. "I'm asking for a price. Cash." The word cash changed the atmosphere in the room. In an economy starved of liquidity, cash was king. The banker named a price. It was low, barely a third of what the land would have been worth 5 years earlier, but it was still a staggering amount of money, the bulk of Jed's life savings. Jed didn't haggle, he just nodded. "I'll take it." He signed the papers and wrote the check. The act felt monumental, the stroke of the pen heavier than any tool he'd ever lifted. He walked out of the bank not feeling like a landowner, but like the custodian of something sacred. His next stop was the small rented house at the edge of town where Warren was living with his family. He found Warren in the backyard, trying to fix a broken lawnmower, his hands covered in grease. He looked up as Jed approached, his expression wary, defensive. "Warren," Jed began, holding out a folded set of papers, "I bought your father's place." Warren's face hardened. He looked away, his jaw tight. "Come to gloat, Jed. Come to rub it in?" "No," Jed said softly. "I came to make you a deal." He unfolded the papers. It was a simple, one-page rental agreement. "I want to rent it to you. The price is 1/3 of the crop, just like the old-timers used to do it. And this," he said, pointing to the last paragraph, "is an option to buy. Any time in the next 10 years, you can buy the land back from me for exactly what I paid for it today. Not a penny more." Warren stared at the paper, then up at Jed. His eyes filled with a confusion that slowly gave way to a dawning, incredulous understanding. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, his shoulders starting to shake as the weight of the last year finally broke him. "Why?" Warren finally choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything, the way I treated you. Why?" Jed looked out over the rooftops of the small town toward the rolling hills where the farm lay. "Because that land has been a Miller farm for 100 years, he said. "It ought to stay that way. And besides," he added, a rare small smile touching his lips, "you're going to need a tractor. I think I know a fella who's got an old John Deere 4020. He's not using much anymore. We can work something out." Word of what Jed had done spread through the county like a slow warming fire. The narrative of Jed's folly was officially dead, replaced by a legend of Jed's wisdom. He became a quiet pillar of the community. Farmers who had survived the crash came to him, not for loans, but for advice. He'd sit with them in his workshop, the smell of grease and steel in the air, and talk about crop rotation, about fixing their own equipment, about the crucial difference between want and need. He never preached, he just shared what he knew. The years passed, the 1980s gave way to a slow, painful recovery. Warren Miller, humbled and hard-working, farmed his ancestral land with a diligence he'd never known before. He and Jed worked side by side during harvest, a quiet partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect. In the 9th year of his option, Warren walked into Jed's kitchen, placed a cashier's check on the table, and bought back his farm. One crisp autumn evening, years later, Jed stood by the fence, watching his own son, now a young man with broad shoulders and capable hands, grease the fittings on the old Versatile. The tractor was no longer a patchwork of rust and primer. Jed had finally given it a proper paint job, a deep industrial red, the color of a job well done. It looked powerful, venerable, a monument of steel that had outlasted an entire economic philosophy. "Dad," his son said, wiping his hands on a rag, "why do we still use this old thing? We could afford a new one now, one with a cab and air conditioning." Jed looked at the machine, its hard angles softened by the golden light of the setting sun. He thought of the auction, the ridicule, the long winters in the shop, the roar of the engine coming to life, the feel of its raw power pulling him through the mud when all others were stuck fast. He thought of what it represented. "Because that tractor doesn't owe any man a dime," Jed said, his voice quiet but firm. "Every bushel it harvests, every acre it plows, it does for us, and us alone. It's not about comfort, son. It's about freedom." He placed a gnarled hand on the young man's shoulder. "Remember that? It's not how shiny the paint is that matters. It's how clean the ledger is." His son nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. He looked from his father's weathered face to the old iron horse standing guard over their fields. He was not just looking at a tractor, he was looking at a legacy. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, the farm settled into a deep and peaceful silence, the kind of quiet that is earned, paid for, and owned outright.